Standing on the moon, I got no cobweb on my shoe. Standing on the moon, I'm feeling so alone and blue. I see the Gulf of Mexico as tiny as a tear. The coast of California must be somewhere over here, over here. Standing on the moon, I see the battle rage below. Standing on the moon, I see the soldiers come and go. There's a metal flame beside me, someone planted long ago. Oh, glory, standing stiffly, crimson, white, and indigo. Oh, glory, standing stiffly, crimson, white, and indigo, indigo. I see all of Southeast Asia, I can see El Salvador. I hear the cries of children and the other songs of war. It's like a mighty melody that rings down from the sky. Standing here upon the moon, I watch it all roll by, all roll by, all roll by, all roll by. Standing on the moon, I see a shadow on the sun. Standing on the moon, the stars go fading one by one. I hear a cry of victory, another of defeat. A scrap of age-old lullaby down some forgotten street. Standing on the moon, where talk is cheap and vision true. Standing on the moon, but I would rather be with you. Somewhere in San Francisco, on a back porch in July, just looking up at heaven, at this crescent in the sky, in the sky. Standing on the moon, with nothing left to do. A lovely view of heaven
Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me out there, and I am trying to see how much of a delay we have. So, if you can hear me, if you could type in and tell me how many fingers I am holding up, that would be great. It would help me tremendously. 2. All right, we're pretty quick then. That's good. Not a huge delay tonight, which is really great. I'm excited about that. And am excited to be back and with all of you. And it's great. It's been a while since I feel like it's crazy. I feel like it's been forever since we met like this in front of the computer screen. And it's been even longer than that since we had a Eucharist, which will be a little bit of our topic tonight. But it has certainly been a wild and crazy year. But I'm glad to be here with you all. I hope you're gathered around your favorite screen with your favorite drink or pint or tea or whatever you may be enjoying tonight. I'm enjoying a nice, just a Mexican beer, a Victoria. It's delicious. And excited to talk to you guys about some theology and history too. But first, as we always do, I wanted to start with a little bit of art. And let me bring up this piece, and I just want to get your reactions to it and what you think of it. It is a fresco. It is by Fra Angelico. Does anybody know what is... You can't see me, but I'm talking behind this image. Does anybody know what this is an image of? What's happening in this scene? It's pretty famous. It's painted a bunch. I can't remember if I don't think we've used this one exactly before, but we've certainly used it in some of these pints. Any takers out there? Don't be shy. This is a depiction of the Annunciation. There you go. Way to go, Elizabeth Shaw out there. She got it. Just as I said it. And so this, of course, is the... Yeah, there we go. Now they're coming in. This is close, but even more important than that, Rogers. It is the angel coming to tell Mary that she is going to be birthing the Son of God. And so it is this pivotal moment that we call the Annunciation. It is the archangel coming to Mary. This is, some of you may have seen this. This is in Florence, in a monastery in Florence. If you have seen it in person, I am incredibly jealous. But what do you, just for a second, what does this image, what are the first things you think about when you see this image? Just maybe about the way it's presented. If there's any oddities, how about the colors, the schemes? And if you've seen these before, there are some stark differences between this and the typical depictions of the Annunciation. Mary's humility. Yes, she's humble. Some people say she doesn't look very happy in this. But there is a humbleness to this entire piece. I think, to this entire depiction. Pillars and arches are unrealistic. Good. Yeah, she is clutching her belly. It does seem that way. I have something I want to show you guys too, only because And again, if you've seen this in person, you will know. I have not. But I found a really great video on this that I want to show you because it's from two art scholars. Yeah, they are. They do mimic each other, and that's sort of classic in the Annunciation, as they sort of mimic you. Yeah, very simple, not too colorful, and yeah, the angel's wings are incredible. They really are. And Mary doesn't look 14. No, she looks a little older in this. True. Sometimes she is depicted very young, but she does look a little older in this to me. And you know, I am not an art scholar. Obviously, you can tell by my language that I'm using, but I found a video of this that is filmed on location with two really well-known and well-regarded art professors. And so I want to play that for you all. It worked earlier, and I'm hoping it's going to work now. But I think it will give you a sense, and you guys touched on a lot of what they're actually going to touch on. I think it will give you a sense of how this fits into the space where it is located. So I'm going to give this a go and see if I can get it working.
We're in the large complex that is the convent of San Marco in Florence, and we're standing in one of the cloisters. It's a beautiful space with frescoes in all of the lunettes and a large fresco by Fra Angelico of the Crucifixion. The monastery itself is Dominican, and that is one of the begging orders. This is a space where people would have given up their worldly possessions and traded them in for a life of prayer and solitude.
And it's a famous place largely because this is where Fra Angelico spent most of his life and where he painted a whole series of frescoes that we're going to go take a look at.
As we walk past a second cloister on the left and the refectory, which includes a large fresco by Ghirlandaio of the Last Supper, we walk up the stairs. We pass numerous family crests of the Medici. It reminds us that they were the dominant patrons of this convent.
And in fact, Cosimo de' Medici had a cell of his own that he used on occasion.
When we get to the top of the stairs, we can see down two long hallways.
About every 10 or so feet, there's an opening with a small wooden door into a small cell that would have been a space for a monk to sleep, but also a place for prayer and meditation. And on the walls are frescoes by Fra Angelico and his followers.
This must be freezing in the winter. There's no insulation whatsoever.
No.
Let's turn our attention to the large fresco at the top of the stairs, though. It's really a masterpiece.
This one is quite large and has figures that are life-size. It starts about 4 feet off the ground, so we can look up at the scene of the Annunciation.
But it also allows us to see this fresco much more close up than we'd normally be able to in a large, say, basilica environment.
That's true. We're not far away the way we might see an altar.
It's just a beautiful image, but it's also very spare, and the spareness seems to really be fitting for this monastic space.
Right, and the actual loggia or open porchway space that the Madonna and the Angel Gabriel occupy seems to match the cloister that we were just in and the windows that we see around us. We see in the room behind Mary. So it really feels as though Mary and the Angel Gabriel are in a space very much like the one that the monks themselves inhabited, which must have helped them to think about this moment of the Annunciation.
This is the Annunciation. Our Archangel Gabriel has appeared to Mary to announce to her that she'll be bearing God. Now, what's interesting is that in many paintings of the Annunciation, you would expect to see a lot of other kinds of accoutrements. You would expect to see white lilies as a symbol of her virginity. You would expect to see her having been interrupted reading the Bible, expressing her piousness. And some art historians have suggested that some of these symbols are missing because the monks already know the story well. This painting doesn't have to be as didactic as it might have to be if its audience was a lay audience in a church.
It gives room to the monks themselves to fill in the rest of the story for themselves, and I think that's one way in which it was an aid in prayer. It was so simple and so spare, not only this fresco but the ones in the cells too, that it would not interfere with the monks' own imaginings.
There's two things that I think are worth pointing out which is understanding this fresco within the context of these hallways on the second floor of the monastery. For one thing, as we look down the hallway, we see doors that are too small for this space, and there's a kind of interesting relationship between the receding doors and the receding orthogonals that we see down the hallway on the left and the loggia, the columns on the left, is leading to a doorway that is visually too small also. And so there's a nice complement that exists there. The other thing is that the vanishing point seems too high and the floor seems to be too steep. But when you look at this fresco as you ascend the staircase, it makes more sense. You're seeing it at an extreme...
From far below.
That's right, in an oblique angle. And so I think it's really important to understand this painting not in the isolation of a reproduction, but spatially in the context of San Marco.
I think that's true. There's really no atmospheric perspective.
So that raises another interesting issue here, which is there's real ambiguity in the space of this painting. You've got that flatness on the left side, this insistence on the two-dimensionality of the forest, of the lawn, and then there's ambiguity on the right side as well. There is some reference to linear perspective, but at the same time, the figures are much too large for this space.
Right, if Mary stands up, she's going to hit her head on the ceiling. For Masaccio, the space and the scale of the figures would really have to be perfectly aligned. I think that there are a number of ways that Fra Angelico is balancing competing needs. For example, if we think about light, which is one of the things that was so important for Masaccio just 20 years or less before this was painted, we do see light coming in from the left.
Yes, from the upper left.
And so when you look at the columns, they're clearly modeled. We can see shadowing on the right.
And especially in the groin vaults.
But I don't see cast shadows from the columns. So maybe there's a little bit of one in that one on the left.
Very soft.
But there is more of a shadow that Mary casts on the right.
In the earthly sphere.
And the angel Gabriel doesn't seem to cast a shadow. If you look at their halos, he's using those flat, round halos like we saw in the 1300s, and not those foreshortened halos that we see Masaccio use.
There does seem to be a willful kind of historicizing in that sense, or a kind of not complete acceptance of the fully earthly rendering that is so prominent in Florence in the 15th century, and especially at this moment.
It's almost totally aware of Masaccio and what we might call the most advanced humanist styles, but also an unwillingness to go that far and holding to more conservative or traditional aspects in some ways. And it does seem to totally make sense given the monastic environment that we're in, and also Fra Angelico's own spirituality.
That kind of tension really speaks to these developing techniques as having a spiritual or even political dimension, and that these were things that could be chosen.
There were lots of styles that were available in the 15th century in Florence, depending on a whole lot of things.
There's also subtlety. For example, we were talking about the spareness of this painting. There are areas where the artist allows himself to really create a very decorative set of forms. For instance, look at Gabriel's wings. Not only are they just beautifully detailed, but if you look really carefully, and this is something that doesn't come across in photographs, he must have used a kind of mica or some sort of mineral that really catches the light, because as you walk past this fresco, it picks up light and twinkles.
It does. It sparkles a little bit, especially in the darker paint. Look at how Mary and the angel look similar, both idealized, but a kind of lack of specificity.
You know, the faces, although they're generalized, are very specific in certain ways as well, especially around the eyes, which are actually the most detailed part of the entire painting.
You really feel, even though they're separated by this column, that their gazes meet and are locked in place. And the way that Mary bends forward a bit and accepts her responsibility that Gabriel's announcing to her feels very, very serious to me.
Very solemn. So should we go and take a look at some of the cells?
Sure.
We're looking in one of the very small monk cells. It's a small dorm room, really. Maybe 8 by
10 feet.
10 feet,
10
not
12
even.
feet. It's very small, with a window and
Okay, just wanted to make sure that my sound was back up. I could watch that video all night because I really love those two and their descriptions of all that. But you guys could be art scholars. You hit on almost all those points that they brought up. And if you are ever in Florence, go see that. I always hate watching these videos or when they tell us, that there's something we can only see there, which of course, right? But now I think I have to go see those angels' wings and see them sparkle when I walk past. And that video, which I'll post up somewhere later, share with all of you, is really great. It goes through a full tour of that monastery and the different cells and the artwork in the cells. Really looks to be a very spectacular place. But I'm hoping now to move on to what our topic is for tonight, and that is the early sort of formulations of what we now call the Eucharist and what we understand to be the Eucharist. And so we're going to take a look. We're going to take a look tonight at the early formation of that process. We're not going to go all the way from there to here, but we are going to. You'll see that in the first 100 years, we make a pretty big leap. It's probably even less than that, honestly. In the first probably 30 to 40 years of Christianity, we make a fairly large leap. And so I think you guys will find it pretty interesting. Let me ask you this: where would we go? I mean, where are we going to go if we want to learn about the early Eucharist? Where's the best place for us to look? Where do you guys think? If you were going to pick one spot to try and get some info, some intel on what the early Eucharist or communion looked like. Oh my, Tina. That's one place. Where else might we look? The ancient writings of Hippolytus there. That is not on my agenda for tonight, but it could be later. The Gospels, okay. You're getting a little closer. Getting a little closer with the Gospels. Google. Google is dangerous there, Margaret Ellis. I don't know what it's going to bring up for you, but you can try. Early prayer books. Yeah, there are some. There are some very ancient prayers that are recorded. But let's think about it from Acts. Okay, what is earlier? What is New Testament? What are our New Testament writings that are older than the Gospels and older than Acts? What are our oldest New Testament writings, date-wise, not story-wise? But when they were actually written. No Gnostics. No, I'm kidding. Rogers. But Paul, actually. Mark is the oldest of the Gospels, but Paul's writings are older than the Gospels. And so there is some authority there. We struggle with Paul, especially Episcopalians. We have a really hard time with Paul because he can be really gruff and really rough. But in truth, his writings are older than the Gospels. And so it's just an interesting thing to consider there. The one we're going to look at in particular tonight is Corinthians. And Corinthians was written in about 53 or 54 AD. And so to give you a time frame of that, that's about 20 years after the crucifixion. And that will come into play, Margaret Pennebaker, in some early Jewish prayers. Definitely influence our prayer book. and our liturgy and our thinking of the Eucharist. One thing to be careful, though, is to remember that Judaism, like Christianity, has transformed over time. And so we have to go back and look at first century Judaism to find that stuff we're talking about. But yeah, very similar. So we're going to look at St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians. And so, like I said, about 53 to 54 AD, and to put that into like a, I don't know if you're like me, but 53 to 54 AD, that doesn't make much sense to me. So it's easier to say it's about 20 years after the crucifixion and about 10 years prior to the earliest gospel, which would have been Mark. Okay? And so if we look, and we'll follow this tonight, if we look through from Paul's writings and then follow through the Gospels chronologically, we will be able to see some Eucharistic development just in those writings and those readings that we look at. We're going to be able to learn a lot. And so let's look at Paul first and his letter to the Corinthians, okay? Like so much of our Christian writings, whether it be from Paul or from the early church fathers, or even our Christian writings today from bishops that are writing, we got a letter from the bishop last week about our behavior in this crazy political times. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to read it and sign that pledge to be civil, but I hope you do and check that out. We emailed it out earlier this week. But so much of our Christian writing has to do with correcting behaviors that are out of place. And I think, a lot of our history, just probably human history in general, has to do with that. A lot of our records are that. And so Paul is writing the Corinthians to correct some things that have been going on. There's a lot of stuff in there that he wants to correct. But we're going to focus in on one part of that. And that has to do with the early communion, the early Eucharist. Paul is struggling because the Corinthians are essentially gathering together for a meal, which would have been the early form of the Eucharist. They're gathering together for a meal. The problem is that they are not waiting for everyone to get there to begin the meal. And so Paul, and in his letter, he actually calls out sort of the wealthier, more elite Corinthians, because what they're doing essentially is coming to this community meal, and instead of bringing food to share with everyone, they're bringing their own food to their own table, which we will have to do at our table service, but it's strictly because of COVID, not because of the same thing that was plaguing the Corinthians. But essentially they're bringing their own food to this giant potluck community meal, and they're starting to eat whenever they get there. They're not waiting for everybody else. They're not waiting for the blessings. They're not waiting for the prayers. And on top of that, they're bringing this wine that's meant to be blessed, and they're just getting drunk. And so Paul is saying to them, hey, you got houses for that, right? You got other places to do that. This is not what this is about. And so Paul challenges their behavior. He challenges their behavior, and he implores them to do better and to have a more structured approach to what they're doing. This is not just a dinner to come get hammered and eat a bunch of good food at, right? And be done by the time the poor people that are having to work or struggling in other ways show up to celebrate with you. That's not the way it's supposed to work. And so Paul, in his sort of correcting of the Corinthians, begins to set out some guidelines for how this service is meant to proceed. Okay? 1, all must be present to begin. Okay? Social eating and drinking is to be kept at home. That's not what this is about. It's not a dinner party. It's not a dinner party. And so Paul begins to lay out this template. It begins when all are present. It's a real meal, but it's not a dinner party's probably wrong because you'd wait for your guests at a dinner party. It's not a cocktail party, right? It's a real meal. all contribute who can, and all partake even if they can't. And it always opens with the Jewish blessing over bread. And so you'll see this was a very familiar rhythm to a Jewish meal. And so it opened always with the bread and with a blessing. And then Paul directs that the bread is to be broken into pieces and distributed, right? And so this is probably identified with the body of Christ being broken into pieces, unified, and then broken into pieces. So that is at the beginning, right? The bread is blessed, and I'll read you the words from that Jewish blessing. Simple, right? Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. And that blessing was said. The meal would then continue, and then at the end of the meal, right? And this is part of that Jewish custom as well. Then the cup would be blessed. And the blessing of the cup is a little more involved. And it really becomes a pronunciation of a proclamation, really, of our salvation history, of what God has done for us through the ages. Can anyone think of a similarity with our service? When do we essentially begin to pronounce all these things that God has done for us, all this salvation that has occurred? We sort of list it off. There's a certain part in the service that takes place. If any of you can think of that while I take a sip of my beer. Where do we list that salvation history? It usually occurs in our Eucharistic prayer, right there at the early parts of the Eucharistic prayer. We begin to list the things that God has done for us, and Jesus is sort of the completion of that action. Yeah, we do it in the Creed too. Creed is another great example of something that exists to correct behavior. In the Creed we speak of it. But if you look at the Eucharistic prayer, we go all the way back to the very beginning there. We begin to sort of spill out all these salvation acts that God has done, and it completes with Christ, right? And so just likewise, it's thought that during this time, a blessing or a declaration of Christ's death, resurrection, and return was made. Just like our modern day Eucharistic prayer. Where we say those again, and in the Nicene Creed, just mention that. But that's that pattern, okay, of bread, meal, cup, right? That follows the Jewish custom, all right. One thing that's really interesting I was reading about today that I never really thought and reflected on, okay, is that pattern there of bread, meal, cup. That follows the Jewish tradition. But one thing that doesn't follow the Jewish tradition is the common cup. And so it is interesting, and by common cup, I mean the sharing of a singular cup, which to us, to many of us that have grown up in the Episcopal Church and taken communion in the Episcopal Church, is really fundamental to our faith, and is one of the things that we are really struggling with right now with the COVID situation. But there were some writings I was reading today in an old textbook that talked about the fact that perhaps, and it would make sense, perhaps this was ritual was essentially created by Jesus to emphasize the oneness of those with him. And we all know, I talked about it in a sermon a couple weeks ago, we all know that Jesus had this really special talent of taking traditions that were well known, stories that were well known, practices that were well known, and transforming them to a new reality. And so that would totally make sense. That idea of the common cup sort of originated perhaps at the Last Supper, which is the next place that we would go to explore this. As mentioned earlier, someone mentioned Mark, which is always a good place to start because Mark is the oldest of the synoptic gospels. Mark is the oldest gospel that we have. And of course in Mark and in Matthew and in Luke, we have this narrative of Eucharist essentially at the Last Supper. There's a difference though between what Paul lays out to the Corinthians and what occurs in Mark and Matthew and Luke, and we'll see that as it we'll see sort of history developing and the Eucharist developing as we look at that. One big thing that's different is that Paul does not mention the Passover meal at all in his narrative. Mark, Matthew, Luke clearly place that Last Supper as a Passover meal. Gospel of John does not do that, and so those are just some interesting things to think about. Another difference is that in Mark and in Matthew, the bread and the wine are joined together during the meal, right? So in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we have this clear separation of bread. Oh, you guys have a mirror of me. So of bread at the beginning and wine at the end of the meal, right? In Matthew and Mark, those are joined together. Those processes are joined together, and we're just told that they happen during the meal at some point. Mark and Matthew also include directions on taking the bread. I mean, actually tell us, take the bread, take the cup. And then interestingly enough, by the time we get to Luke, right, the bread and the wine in that story, in the upper room, that same story, by the time we get to Luke, the bread and the wine have moved so that they are now occurring at the end of the meal. At the very end of the meal. So we had bread at the beginning, wine at the end in Paul's letters, right? Then we go to the bread and wine together sometime during the meal. And then by the time we get to Luke, so we're really this is not a lot of history. I mean, this is Nixon to Trump. That's the timeline we're working with. By the time we get there, we have got a shift in how this is celebrated, because what most scholars think is that during the time that Mark's gospel is written, Mark mirrors that meal at the Last Supper with what his culture was doing at the time, with what the people at the time were doing. And so at that time, the people simply had the bread and the wine sometime during the meal. And then by the time we get to Luke and Luke's gospel, which is not that much, it's a blip on the map of time, we've already changed so that the bread and the wine are most certainly occurring at the end of those suppers, right? So just how in that painting that we saw of the Annunciation, how that painting of an event that happened, 15 centuries earlier, that event that happened takes on the shape of that location, right? It took on the shape of that monastery. So just like that, the Gospels sort of take on the shape of the community around them, the writer that's writing about them. Yeah? And so we can really see through this time this progression of what's happening with the bread and with the wine. Does that make sense to everybody? I'll stop here for a second and see if anybody has any questions. Because I kind of rambled on, and usually I can see someone usually twitching in their chair if they have a question. Thanks, Tina. Good. I hope it makes sense. It's pretty straightforward, really. And it really is sort of astonishing that we have changed from obviously, right? We're in these churches covered in, I've got the silk on, and we've got stained glass, and we got all the silver and all that. We really have not moved that far in word and understanding from what the early Christians were doing. It really is quite spectacular. At some point, kind of after the Gospels are written, and just a side note, just so you guys know and remember, the Gospel of John does not have a meal. I mean, it references a meal, but it does not have the words of institution, that breaking of the bread and the wine, take this and remember me. It does not have that. Instead, we have that very famous scene that we recreate Maundy Thursday with Jesus washing his disciples' feet in the Gospel of John. So sometime between Luke and when we begin to pick up this narrative again and get to dive into it and get some historical reference again, at some point the prayer over the bread is abolished. We kind of lose that prayer over the bread, and we get this, we maintain that prayer over the wine, which has that great salvation history in it, like I talked about, and that becomes the one prayer. That becomes sort of the ancestor of our modern day Eucharistic prayer. Yeah, it is important to understand where this all began. And so we're starting to develop that, but we have this chunk of history, as you'll see, that's sort of missing. There's a lot of reasons for this, right? Because early Christianity was a dangerous place to be, and so we're missing some history here. But by 153 AD, we have an account from Justin Martyr, okay? And I'm going to read to you what his account of the Eucharist is, and I think it's going to be pretty. I think you're gonna see it's going to be familiar to you. So this is from Justin Martyr in 153, right? So we're talking about a 100-year. We're talking about a 100-year span here of time, right? Because Paul was I forgot already. That's how it worked. But 52 or 53 AD, I believe. Yeah, 53 or 54. So we're talking about 100 years, right? And so suddenly, within 100 years, this is what we have from Justin Martyr. The service begins with readings and a sermon. It's followed by common prayer. Then the bread and the cup are brought forth to the president, is what would have been the priest, or the presider. Bishop in a lot of cases. Then the Eucharistic prayer is said, and this is interesting because we have this very sparse sort of bullet point of his recollection, but he makes sure to put that the Eucharistic prayer is said and Amen. And what he is referring to is what we call the Great Amen, which is that Amen at the Eucharistic prayer, which we always like to hear as priests. We like to hear you all thunder that out because it is the great Amen. And so it's interesting here that is really emphasized, right? Almost just, it's Eucharistic prayer, Amen. So that Amen was really important, that response from the people. And then distribution of of communion, of the bread and the wine, and then the service ends. And so that's pretty similar to our service. And you'll notice there's no post-communion prayer on there, so maybe we shouldn't be hard on those folks that decide to dip out a little early. But we do, of course, have that post-communion prayer added on. And actually, I did miss one bullet point on here in my transposition, and that is that there was the peace exchange, and it was a kiss, which is certainly off limits now. Tina, there could have been music in there, placed in there, but he had sort of a brass tacks bullet point. My guess is that there would certainly be some sort of music in there, whether it would be the Psalms being sung or different elements of the service music. I'd have to go back and check. But essentially, it follows our service, right? The word, the sermon, the prayers, Holy Communion. That's it. I mean, that's our Eucharist, right there. And so within 100 years, we're there. And most historians think it happened quick, this transformation, because it was so widespread and that so many people conformed to it. And so they think it was a really rapid sort of change. Why do you all, just curious, why do you all think that might have been the case? I have no answer, by the way. But why do you think it would have changed from this big sort of meal together to suddenly this more structured approach? Do you all have any theories out there? And I really am just curious to hear what you think. There could have been a million reasons. I will say typically, almost always, changes to liturgy occur for practical reasons. So while you're thinking of answers, I'll tell you that. It's almost always practical reasons. Now, we usually come back in later and we add sort of a spiritual component to it because that's kind of the way we are and it's the way we like to think about it, right? And it ties us into a tight bow. Yeah, that's one. I mean, growing church could be one, Margaret. Another one could be that people were just acting a fool. I think you're right, Charles. People were just acting crazy. And Paul was like, you got to tighten this thing up, you know? Certainly early on. Yeah, there had to be structure to get people to conform, right? As we grow and we get away from certain personalities and we need things to be repeatable, we need structure. I think another reason maybe was that it was not like, you know, being a Christian was not the safest thing to be in a lot of places in the early church. And, you know, gathering together and having a big meal together probably was not, you know, was not great. And so maybe they needed to create this service that could sort of happen. Happen quickly, happen efficiently, you know. And then of course it's grown into, you know, what we have today, which can be this beautiful sort of eruption of spirit and emotion. But perhaps during those early times it was difficult to do that, to gather. Maybe better to go unnoticed. But usually, you know, these changes always happen from a practical standpoint. And then we add the spiritual element in later. You know, we may see that. You may be living through that now. There may be a transformation because of the health issues that we're going through now and that may continue to arise where things have to be changed and transformed. And then perhaps one day, 200 years from now, there will be some spiritual element that is sort of added and reflected back upon that. Yeah, clear meaning of the Eucharist, of the source of it, yes. Could be, right? Over time, we really hammer in. Those words of institution are hammered into us. Yeah, Jesus telling us, breaking the bread, blessing the wine. Take this in remembrance of me. Huge, very unifying for us Um, and so it really became that. I mean, there's theories out there, and this, I mean, we certainly aren't the first group of humans to be lazy and have a low attention span. There's theories out there that people just got sick of meeting and having the big meal every time, and we're like, can we just get to the thing at the end that we do, the bread and the wine, and just do that part and just be done? I don't have all day, right? Kids got I don't know, chariot practice, maybe something like that. But yeah, I bring this up tonight and wanted to talk to you guys about it a little bit. Really, in light of this table service that we are planning on doing in the future, we're going to do it the second Wednesday night in dessert first. Yeah, we're going to do it the second Wednesday night in November. I'm very excited about it. I've done sort of different variations on this, but I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about what that might look like, and what we're sort of thinking in our approach to this. What are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to do something that's very old, but yet at the same time something that's very new for us. And I think it's important to remember that it's old, but it's also new, right? There is a history, there is a pattern of Christians gathering together for a meal in the past. That's important, right? It's always important to be rooted in some sort of history. But it's also important to realize that we are doing something new also, because we're a new group in a new time. And so it's important for us to remember that we are not playing sort of ancient church, right? We learn this really early in seminary. If you go to a good seminary, you learn it really early that, because sometimes priests get a little carried away. It's important to remember, right, that when we're up there celebrating the Eucharist, I'm not Jesus. You're not the disciples. This is not dinner theater. We are not recreating. It's not a play, right? We're not having like a cosplay, Christian cosplay. We're not doing that. And so it's important to realize that we are doing something old and new, right? We're not imitating something. It's a new path we're taking. And so as we do this, it's important to keep these four things in mind. This is kind of what we're trying to do. And this liturgy is being shaped right now. It'll be ready to go the second week in November, but it's not quite ready yet, because we want to focus on a couple things. We want to tell the stories of our salvation, right? It's clearly important from the very beginning, right? If you go prior to Jesus, if you go to our forefathers, back to the Abraham and Moses, the stories of our salvation are critical, passed down, right? And so we need to do that. We need to tell the stories of our salvation from our unique Christian lens. The bow, right? The icing on the cake to that, the grand finale is Jesus Christ, right? Is the penultimate sort of declaration of our salvation. And so we need to follow that story, not just the story of Jesus, but the pattern of God saving His people throughout, which is a great story to retell and revisit in this year. Have you all seen the Christmas ornaments for this year? I've got to get a bunch of them. One is like a dumpster fire, and there's a bunch of great ones out there. But Google it or go on Etsy. There's some great Christmas ornaments out there. In this time, right? Let's talk about the fact that God is out there advocating for us in the world. So that's bullet point one, is our salvation history, to share that with each other, with our children. Yeah. The second thing we want to do is we want to gather together. And it's going to be weird because we have this virus going around, right? And so we've got to bring our own food. We've got to sit at our own tables, and we've got to be a little bit separate. But my hope is that this is one thing that carries on long after this COVID stuff, and that we continue to do this. And when the barriers come down, we're ready, right? And we can set the tables as close to each other as we want, right? We can share each other's mashed potatoes or whatever. And so it is important for us to gather together in fellowship, as we're doing right now tonight. I've learned one thing from this. It's that sometimes online can be better and more meaningful than in person with the face masks on. In truth, we did a vestry meeting last night online, our first one in a while, where we were all online and not split into two different groups, and it felt great. It felt better, honestly, than even having a few people in person, because we were together. So any way that we can be together in fellowship is critical, and we want to pray, right? It's a cornerstone for us. Is pray. We want to pray. We want to pray for the world. We want to pray for the nation. We want to pray for those that are sick and injured. We want to pray for ourselves and for our own families to be better. So we want to pray, and then we want to remember Jesus, right? It's important to note that what we're going to be doing is not the Holy Eucharist in its technical term, right? In its academic and ecclesiological way. It is instead us getting together, breaking bread, sharing wine, right, and remembering Jesus, which is what he asks us to do. In the upper room, in Mark and Luke and Matthew, and we'll leave John out of it for now. I'm not going to make you wash each other's feet once a month, but maybe one day. There's a group called the Primitive Universalist Baptists, believe it or not, in Appalachia, and they wash each other's feet every Sunday. That's their form of sacrament. So they take wholeheartedly the way that we take the synoptic gospels and what happens in the last room. They take the Gospel of John and take it to heart. So we are very excited about this, and I'll share with you. I'll pull out just for a second this. Our closest sort of form, something that we'll be kind of based loosely on, but not completely, is in the Book of Occasional Services. There is this thing called the Agape Meal, or the Love Feast, and it can be celebrated anytime. The one in the Book of Occasional Services is celebrated on Maundy Thursday, so it has a little bit of it has a feel, as you know. Those of you that have come to church on Maundy Thursday, it's a very unique night. It has a very somber feel to it, and so this liturgy sort of takes that on. But you will notice some pieces in here, and one of those is the blessing over the bread. Right, starts out almost identical to that one I mentioned earlier. Blessed are you, O Lord God, King of the universe. You bring forth the bread from the earth, and on this night you have given us the bread of life in the body of your Son, Jesus Christ. As grain scattered upon the earth is gathered into one loaf, so gather your church in every place into the kingdom of your Son. To you be glory and power forever and ever. Amen. And there is a blessing over the wine. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe. You create the fruit of the vines, and on this night you have refreshed us with the cup of salvation. Remember that blessing over the wine always included a salvation history. This has sort of thinned it out and just boiled it down to one word, salvation, but it's there. In the blood of your Son, Jesus Christ, glory to you forever and ever. Amen. And there are some other blessings for the other food, the pattern we will follow. But we will put together a really great liturgy for that. And I'm hoping that some of you will come and more people will come and partake in that, because I think it will be a very special, really special thing. So I'm gonna stop talking now, as we've got about 5 minutes left, and see if you guys have any questions at all that you'd like to ask. I'll answer them if I know them. I Some of them I probably won't know the answer to, but I'll tell you that I'll look them up for you. Um, yeah, I hope this gave you just a little. We could teach on this on the Eucharist. We could just teach on it for just constantly. We could never stop. I mean, there's so much information out there. There's just, I mean, this book here. This is the study of liturgy, but probably 3/4 of this book is just all Eucharistic history, and it doesn't even touch on theology. A little bit it does, but we could go just for eons on this. But I hope this gave you a little glimpse of what it may have looked like in the early church and how it came to be to what we celebrate now. And it was really a quick process. I don't know if we're ever going to really know why those steps were taken, but we can clearly see in the gospel that steps were taken, and that they happened kind of in rapid succession of one another. And that within 100 years, we went from a meal together with bread, blessed at the beginning, and wine at the end, to something very similar to what we celebrate now. That transformation. Any questions out there? Well, I'll play some music while you're thinking of them, because I have this new toy that allows me to play music with the punch of a button, which is very exciting. So I'll give you a little taste of what's coming up on the gospel show this week, and you can think of any questions you might have, and I'll be here to answer them.
It's raining in Los Angeles. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Moonflowers open to breathe the night's perfume. The city climbs a hillside just to see the color bloom.
Yes, Margaret, you will need to bring your own bread and wine, and we'll send out some stuff on that. I wish there was another way. There just isn't right now. But yeah, people bring their own bread and wine, and we encourage, even though, so that Maundy Thursday rubric, and we send it out. It's in your stewardship package. You'll see there is some information on this, and I included the rubrics from the agape meal for Maundy Thursday, which encourages a simplified meal. And I thought, you know what, I liked keeping that in there. So you can bring bread and wine, you can bring olives, you can bring cheese, but I like the fact of keeping it simple, because I think in going back to, like we talked about with Paul and the Corinthians, it keeping it simple keeps it accessible to a lot of people, right? So it's pretty easy to just grab some bread and some wine, right? And a few simple things, and keep it that way. And then, we don't need a table with caviar and, Jack Brantley filet, or tenderloin and all that. No hot dogs and popcorn. My heart is broken, but one day, the hot dogs and popcorn will return. Beverly, what was the political culture? Were the Christians oppressed during this time? Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the span of 100 years, and we're talking about a variety of places. But I think in general, the answer would be yes. And so it would have varied depending on local leadership. And from Rogers. Yes, I think we've all missed Eucharist a bunch, and we've had this struggle as we've tried to figure out what to do about approaching that with sticking to our traditions, and it's not to be sort of it's not to be fundamentalist or like originalist about any of it. It's really just to say there are some things that are really important to our spiritual understanding of this, such as the common cup, such as the approach to the altar and kneeling before the altar in our particular, even just in our community. And so it's been a really tough tightrope to think about how do we now celebrate this in a way that honors that and doesn't diminish it or cheapen it, for lack of a better word. And so it's tough. Do we put bread in Ziploc bags or plastic cups? Do we have 50 plastic cups up on the altar? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but it's part of the challenges, right? Because our faith really is so much more physical, I think, than we really understand until it's taken away from us. And by that I mean the smell of walking into the church, the creaks under your feet, right? The touch of the pews, the standing and the sitting, right? The voices that we hear and we're used to hearing every Sunday, those in tune and those out of tune, right? Every part of it, right? The coughs and sneezes, the walking up to the rail, the kneeling, is all such an important part of our faith. And all of it, I mean, there's so much of our faith that is so sensory oriented, and we forget that sometimes. I think in our sort of Western culture that we really are. We use all five senses, and so I'm going off on a total tangent. So I'm sorry, but it has become this. There's a lot to reflect on as we try and put these services together. And I really do truly believe that one day we're going to get back to a common cup and coming up to the rail and distribution the way that we know it so well. But if not, we will move on and we will find new ways. And part of this, exploring this table service, is what we're going to call it, is part of that. And trying to fill that gap. Well, I wish you all a wonderful night. It feels great to be back and doing this. I've missed the connection and being able to be right in front of the screen and to interact with you all. And so I look forward to doing this more often. We are going to have Pints with the Priest is going to be the third Wednesday of every month, and the table service that I mentioned will be the second Wednesday of every month, and then our book study on the book Think Like a Monk will be the first Wednesday of every month. So yeah, Liz, being unfamiliar with the Episcopal Eucharist, and I cannot wait to get you even more familiar with it when we can finally celebrate it again in church. It'll be great. The problem is, Rogers, I have it on a button, which means I don't see the artist in front of me. But it'll be on the gospel show this week, and I'll email David and let him know who it was. But her name is I'm missing it right now. But it's good. It's new. So it'll be on the gospel show this week, along with some other great music. And I'll play you guys out with some of that. And until we see each other again, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May He shine His light upon you. May He keep you safe now and always. Amen.
I